All right, well, I'm going to get started. I'm not going to wait for anyone here. My name's Colin Whedon. You're at the Biotech Family Office panel, and we have the brain trust of the family offices in the biotech world here accompanying me. I am not one of them. I am just moderating. I run Boston Innovation Capital, which is a investment bank that is a wholly owned subsidiary of Life Science Nation. I have, however, had many, many years of interactions and dealing with managing family offices. And I always like to talk to people about the misconception that many in the life sciences arena have about family offices. First, I'd say that though family offices are the fastest growing asset management segment in the world, their exposure to life sciences is very limited. And it's limited for a number of reasons. It is very difficult to get talent and pay talent at a family office level like the people here, and I'm sure they will acknowledge this. But most importantly is that family offices, unlike either funds with a mandate or endowments or anyone that's governed by a pure asset allocation model, family offices don't have to invest in life sciences. I mean, it's a pain in the neck. It's really hard. It's very time consuming, and it's usually not a big percentage of an asset of a portfolio. So, getting access and finding the family offices that actually focus on this is a big challenge. But I will say those that do focus on it approach it very similar to any other investor in the class. So there is often this, I get approached all the time. It's like, oh, I don't want to talk to those crazy VCs. He goes, I just want to talk to family offices. They're easy. And I just laugh. It's just so far from the truth. There's no difference, and I'd say there's certainly no difference in due diligence. There is a difference in terms of time horizon. There is not a constraint with regard to a 7-year fund or anything along those lines that a VC may have. So that's kind of the family office backdrop that I always like to throw out there. It's always hopefully educational for someone in the crowd. Joining me is Pini Orbach down at the end from Arkin Ventures, who brings a nice little transatlantic perspective. We also have Christine Bunt from 2020, Jason Rieger from PBM, Alex Pickett from
Medic Ventures.
I always call it MedIQ, but Medic Ventures, which is one of Jim Mellon's groups. Thought I would let everyone introduce themselves, give a little background, and then we're going to try to attack some topics that hopefully will be interesting. And I would encourage everyone to ask questions during the course of the conversation and don't save them up until the end. So, Pini, why don't you kick it off and give us a little background?
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Pini Orbach from Israel, managing Arkin Bioventures, which is the investment arm for biotech pharma of Arkin Holdings. It's a family office funded in 2009 in Israel by Mr. Arkin, sold at that time, a few years ago, his generic company to Perrigo, Agis to Perrigo, and he's a major investor in the life sciences in Israel. Under the Arkin Holdings, we have a hedge fund called Sphera Health. We also have a medical device investment arm called ExxonMed, Arkin Bioventure, and we also have activity in the dermatology space. We are the largest life science investors in Israel, and and to add to what you said, although we are a family office, we are very specialized, very fundamental, investing in the life science and the biotech at early stage, and round A, sometimes in round B. We are co-invest with VCs in the US and elsewhere. We are now global deals that we've done. We've done Merck deal in 2015 on an immuno checkpoint for $605 million. That was a company we established. We also, a company that you might know is Eurogen that just went public a few months ago in the neuro-oncology space. So we are very active in oncology, metabolic, orphan diseases, and we are fundamental investing in technologies that we believe that are have differentiated themselves from the technologies that are out there, and we are very science-driven. That's basically.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Christine Bund. I'm a venture partner with 2020 Healthcare Partners. We're not a typical family office. We actually consider ourselves as a private investor group. It was interesting, the comment we had earlier about the constraints family offices have to venture into therapeutics and biotech. A lot of that is capital constraints because developing drugs is unfortunately a very capital-intensive venture. So we actually did a collaboration with a private equity company which allows us to get in with companies. We started very early, me and my partner who's in the audience, I'm not going to point him out now. But we'd love to get involved early. We both have entrepreneurial backgrounds, so maybe that's a little bit different to general investor groups. But you want to stick with the company. You want to be able to participate into future rounds, and that really led us to do this specific collaboration. And I'm happy to elaborate that further. But from an investment-focused perspective within life sciences, we did several deals in the therapeutic areas, cell engineering. We love to work with founders we know and recognize. That's very important to us, and we are very, very much committed to look at new opportunities, breakthrough science, therapeutics in the future. Thank you.
Hello. Jason Rieger with PBM Capital Group, a small family office in Charlottesville, Virginia. We focus on being opportunistic. Our interests and investments have ranged from consumer health to small molecule to biologics, gene therapy, cell therapy, medical devices. So the common thread is opportunistic investment, interesting assets, and creative development programs that are potential for that. Our founder is the first generation entrepreneur, self-made successful individual, and our fund is 100% focused in the healthcare area. We like to be very active partners with the entrepreneurs or companies we invest in. We provide the resources of our team, whether it's legal, finance, clinical development, manufacturing, or whatnot. We have that expertise and bring that to the table with the entrepreneurs or the companies to help advance the programs through inflection points, and then also become very involved in helping raise additional capital for future financings or exit.
I'm Alex Pickett with Medic Ventures. We're a multifamily office in that there are 3 partners. One of them is Jim Mellon. The other 2 are Deck Dugan, who was very involved at Pfizer and later at a number of microcap companies, and Greg Bailey, who's a serial entrepreneur with a background in emergency medicine. So we typically start companies founded around therapeutic area verticals and use those companies as vehicles to make additional investments and build out a portfolio that has exposure to a therapeutic area that we like without some of the asset-specific risk, or at least with less asset-specific risk. So in the past, we've built a company or neuropsychiatric illness called Biohaven. We are the first investors in the company, and it's listed on the New York Stock Exchange last May. And we've also built a cancer immunotherapy company that has exposure to 7 to 10 products right now, and is actively adding additional products. And we're finally beginning to look at aging and the diseases of aging. To build on some of what Jason says, one of the ways the family offices are able to make a number of investments in biotech and to get in early at attractive valuations is by providing additional services to the companies. So we've done everything from put in an entire management team for a spin out from an academic institution to sit back and take a board seat and just follow the company on a monthly basis. So to generalize, there aren't too many generalizations to make about family offices, except that one or two people are writing the check.
Good point. One of the things that I wanted to start with in terms of topics, and I'm going to let everyone just kind of answer ad hoc here, is over the last year we've had a pretty big sea shift in the attitude towards early stage biotechs in the public markets. We've eliminated, rightly or wrongly, an election. We have seen pricing discussions take, instead of the front page, they're probably in the third page now. And we saw an enormous amount of funds that are what I'll call generalists rotate out of early stage bio or early stage therapeutics. We're starting to see that come back and change, which is good this year in 17. So I'd be curious as to kind of the trickle down of that. What does that mean in general for each of, for some of these folks in terms of how they approach their everyday valuation structures? Jason?
Thanks.
I knew it. You knew it was coming.
So, well, I guess the comment I would make to that is we actually have taken advantage of the public markets for 2 of our portfolio companies over the last year and a half. Likely another one, probably mid-late next year. And it's just a good vehicle for raising capital and the big money to take things from later stage towards commercial. We've started looking at some later stage assets, and what we find is we want to get those assets positioned for the larger institutions and the larger funds to invest. So if you're looking at a $3 to $10 million financing, that's sort of hard to do because it's too small for VCs, too large for angels, and you're in the middle of a place. So that's what the money necessary to raise to run a phase 2 trial. That it's hard to find that investment capital. The other thing that we typically do with regards to the financing is because of the strangeness of the market, we tend to invest in deals that we could finance indefinitely ourselves, whether whether other investors come on board, a partner existed, or an exit. And by doing so, it makes attracting other capital just easier. When you don't need the money, it's easier to get the money. It's kind of a strange situation for the entrepreneurs trying to raise capital. But we look at the public markets as a mechanism to get liquidity for founders. Typically not very much liquidity for us, as we tend to end up being board seat and keeping the equity for a long period of time, or long-term holders. But I think the public markets, to your point, are much more accessible to earlier stage companies. And if you happen to be a later stage asset that the public market hasn't seen, it's far more attractive and it's easier to raise the capital. And we have those relationships now to facilitate those opportunities for our portfolio companies.
Anyone else have any comments?
I think one has to be open to perhaps access the public markets, but the problem is we don't have a crystal ball. We can look into it. We had a fantastic ride for quite a while, even to your point, with early assets or companies with early assets going IPO. But we don't know if that window is going to remain open. So I'm always very much fond of a strategy where you don't depend on this. And we are very much attracted to companies where the IPO is not the only answer, might be an upside, but where you have, in the case of therapeutics, a very good exit window, maybe a different stage of development to a pharma partner, or where you can remain private and you don't have that pressure that you need to go IPO.
Can I add to this?
Yes.
From my experience, in the Israeli experience actually, when the market was very open for IPOs, a lot of companies in Israel when IPO in the US, and they were not necessarily the good companies that you want to actually go public. It was almost the opposite. It was almost that IPO was the last resource of funding because they got no from experienced investors. And I think that this is, that era ended, and now we start a new era of IPO. We see more IPOs, but I think that the quality is higher. And I think that from our perspective, when we invest in companies, we're not thinking about should we take it IPO in one point or another. We think about, is that the right technology? Is this technology can succeed? And if it can succeed, at what stage it will become the inflection point, it will create interest from big pharma because we don't have the resources to take it all the way. And if you get to the IPO sometimes because you need to raise significant amount of funding, that perhaps an indication sometimes that the product that you have was not that successful. And I know it sounds kind of weirdo, but this is the case. So I think that right now, companies that have good product, good management, you see the successful IPOs and less of those opportunistic IPOs, and I think this is the way it should be.
Sounds good. You want to say anything?
Yeah, so I think most of the angles on this have been covered, but to summarize, the IPO window being open does allow some relatively novel business plans that involve taking later stage assets and representing them to the market, possibly for different indications. But what it doesn't do is enable fundamentally bad science to go forward. It will not fix your problem, your financing problems if early stage investors are unhappy with the science. Public investors will likely still be unhappy with the science, or at least they will be in 6 months. But one of the other ways to think about the IPO window is really as an alternative. And public money is generally considered to be cheaper than private money. There are many people who just need to buy to fill their index, or people who buy as part of a broader strategy without doing specific due diligence. And the reason that IPOs can be very useful for pharma companies and biotechs isn't just for the cash that they bring, but it's the strategic possibilities that they open up, and it really the strategic possibility of walking away from a pharma partnership. Because the company didn't offer good enough terms, and the biotech can raise its own capital publicly to do that pivotal trial. It's a nice to have situation. It's very nice to have alternatives because that is how you do get good deals from pharma. But a business plan can't really be reliant on it because of the unpredictability. And fundamentally, the things that strong public investors, typically institutional investors, want to see are the very things that private investors want to see, or that pharma wants to see. They'd like to see cutting-edge science that has a therapeutic impact on endpoints that payers will reimburse for. And if you make developing the evidence base for your compound your priority, then you'll do well regardless of the financing environment.
Sounds good. Let's hope the window stays open for a little while without speculative excess, but that never happens, ever. I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about, or at least float up, is the impact of technology in general on the therapeutic industry, the drug development process. How is big data enhancing the economics of the clinical process? And what does that mean from an evaluation prospect? Christine
Actually,
jumps forward on that one.
I'm really excited about this because I know in 2001 we decoded the human genome, and then everybody said, and now what? What do we do with all those data? And I spent 16 years in big pharma, right? So sort of in the dark ages at that point in time when pretty much equally divided between Roche and Merck. And I remember when Merck acquired Rosetta Genomics, probably well ahead of what we are seeing now. Point being, now we are learning how to apply the data. And that has been done in academic institutions, Broad Institute, others. But you see it also now in companies, in startup companies. We just invested in a company who really looks at novel target discovery by predicting genomics, looking at cancer data, and taking the whole process of targeted drug discovery from 2 to 3 years, when you look at what we did a couple of years back with small molecules, to 4 to 6 months with pretty good outcomes. And I think that's incredibly exciting, not just from an investment perspective, but this is we're here, we're investors, and we want to have an exit, etc. But in the end of the day, this needs to benefit patients, and I think this is very, very exciting. So we are very excited about that from an investment perspective.
So I'd add, this is, like Christine said, a really exciting area. One of the applications of big data that she broached, the idea of looking at novel targets, is something that we found to be probably the most exciting thing that's come out of the application of AI techniques to the reams and reams of data that Big Pharma has accumulated over the past decade. So that, I think, is very case by case, and companies that are doing that are typically platform companies that hope to repeat the magic trick they pulled off the first time. But some of the other applications of AI technology or big data in general to pharma companies are a little bit maybe less exciting on face, but still will drive a tremendous amount of value for the industry. And the two ones that I think we should talk about are disease subtyping and outcomes-based payments. So for disease subtyping, perhaps 10, 15 years ago, you might have looked at a broad indication like, say, type 2 diabetes. In 10 years, you may be looking at type 2 diabetes that is driven by a particular mutation in the immune system, or type 2 diabetes with a particular biomarker signal. So this is part of a progressive orphaning of larger disorders into smaller disorders that can be approached by therapies that are particular to the etiology of disease in that patient. And we're very excited to watch the space develop. And I think you're starting to see this in cancer, probably first, and it'll follow through to the other indications. The other thing that we're excited about is outcomes-based pricing. Now that insurers can actually keep tabs on all of their patients, pharma companies can start to get paid not by what they've asked for the drug, which is itself pegged to what other drugs cost, but they can start to get paid based on how whether the drug makes their patients healthier and whether they keeps them out of the hospital. So we think that will start to open up new areas of therapeutic development that might have been a bit static, like metabolic disease.
So I would say that as a group, probably driven by a lot of my own personal bias, is some of the stuff's harder than we can do with our small team. And we typically like to look more at products that have been developed past the lead development and big data stage, and are more at the execution on the clinical stage, because operationally that's hard. Fundamentally, the science has been set. There's some regulatory and other aspects to the execution, and we find that it's very hard to do that part well enough as it is, let alone bring in innovative technologies, software, and new targets. And so we've looked at some of these technologies as they may have led to development of assets. I do think that what Alex is talking about outcome-based measures and performance of products, we pay a lot of attention to as we think about the data we'll generate in the clinical program. But from a pure AI big data perspective, it's not something that we actually look at.
I have nothing major to add. I just thinking about what you guys said. I think that we are still facing translational issues from preclinical research to the clinical stage. And I think until we really understand the human biology and the specialized changes in phenotype of one person, we will continue to tackle failure in the clinic, even though the science will be very reasonable, the target will be well defined and so forth, because I think every person is different that we see. And by the way, we just discussed it outside, the immunocheckpoint world is a great example of doing a lot of preclinical trials on humans and still not really understanding the biology. So I think that with informatics, information technology, and using the data to really understand the patient's phenotypic characteristics, that will be the point where I think we will see more success with drugs. Until then, we're still going after one target, hoping that that's the target. And until we open the data, we don't really know. Even if we have great animal data and whatever, if it's going to work or not. And I think that's where data mining and analyzing this can help.
In terms of, I guess, sectors you're looking at, combined with approaches that people are looking at out there in the audience in terms of entrepreneurs, I would love everyone to give, some guidance to an entrepreneur in terms of whether it's specific to a sector, immunotherapy or something like that, but in terms of how an entrepreneur can best, I don't want to say approach you, but provide their story to you. Just some ideas for everyone, because I think at the end of the day, that's what a lot of people want to hear. So it would be some advice, and I realize that the approach is a little different for different verticals and different disease types. So yeah, I think.
I'll go first on this one. So I think just by example of this conference, I probably saw 200 meeting requests for probably 10 slots that I had available to have meetings. And so you have to make a lot of quick decisions on who am I going to try and talk to and why. And what you'll find is each of us have different filters of things we look for. We are looking probably less so at immuno-oncology and things of that nature because A, the valuations are higher, B, there's so many products in the clinic, and we don't feel we can handicap or assess those technologies in a way where we think we'll be more successful than someone else who may know a lot more. And so we try and find assets that we can differentiate the risk probability of success or failure based on our past experiences and whatnot. And so what you'll find is, like VCs or anyone else, all of us are really, really busy. We see lots and lots of deals. So when I get these emails or requests for meetings from this conference, it's always very helpful for me to know how much money you're trying to raise, what is the valuation, and what stage is your product at. And I actually might have been half the requests I had for meetings that didn't tell me any of those things. And so it makes it very easy to say, okay, I'm not having that meeting. And so I think as you're thinking about like any entrepreneur trying to reach any investor, is you have to get their attention quickly because they're very busy and they see lots of different things, and don't have a mandate to put capital to work, and they're just looking for good opportunities. So very clearly communicate what it is you're trying to do, what your technology is, and what you're trying to raise. It's very frustrating to know that you think a technology is worth $10 million valuation based on all the deals I see, and if someone's asking for $150 million pre-money, that's really great, and I hope you get it. It's just not going to be something for me. And so you'll weed out the investors who aren't interested, but you also will get a higher quality of of investor meetings that will be more tailored to what you're looking for.
I can say from my perspective, judging by the presentation that I got, I also got about 200. Cancer was solved. It's not a disease anymore. But that's not the case. So I think that what really, this is something people don't like to say, but I'll say it openly. We are basically an industry, like any other industry, and we are there investing, hoping to actually generate revenues to our shareholders, and it's a business. And I think to go along with what you said, I think that what's missing to me in many of the presentation is really a good analysis of the landscape and pointing out at what point we will generate data based on, of course, on your product that you have, generate data, such a compelling data that it will be, nobody will be able to ignore that product. And that will actually be an inflection point for us, and it will attract big pharma, or it will allow us to go public or whatever. But really to explain to me why in 2 years or 3 years from now, in phase 1 will be better than, and what better than will be, and who is actually going to be interested in this product. And this is, usually I don't see it. I see data, I see names of really renowned people that in the space, some preclinical data and so forth, but really no clear analysis why you differentiate, real differentiate from the rest. And this is tough because we see hundreds, if not thousands, of projects all the time. And getting your message out is in this sense, you have to understand who you're talking to when you approach investors, not only family offices, but definitely us.
I think I want to echo some of the points which Pini just did, and we had a heated discussion actually prior to the panel about immunotherapy and oncology, so I address that in a second. But I think it's very important to show in pitch decks your thinking pattern, how you can make a difference, and where the exit will be, or how you're building, continuing to build value. Let me translate that a little bit sort of in what we are interested in with 2020. We really like breakthrough ideas. So in the context of immune therapy and oncology, no, we're not shying away. I know there's a lot out there. There's also a lot of noise, but there are also good news. If you look, for instance, of the field of immuno-oncology with the PD-1, the CAR-Ts, we were talking about traditional drug development. Some of these compounds, some of those therapies made it very, very fast to patients, and the data is good. A lot of this is also driven by data, okay? But on the other hand, I'm putting my investor hat back on here. If you really look where the activity in immune therapy currently is, it's T-cell centric therapy. The response rates in that market are 20 to 25% of all cancers. We haven't cracked the other 75% yet. There are 1,500 combination trials currently ongoing in that field, in 20 to 25%. So there is still room, but you need to think about different solutions. You can't just come with another PD-1. There are 89 compounds in China already, right? Or another T-cell therapy. Maybe there's still a little bit of space, but there's a whole market here for crabs. So I think if an entrepreneur could adequately address that, we certainly would look at it. Same with neurology, neurodegenerative diseases. I think not just therapeutics, but perhaps to better predict good pathways and targets, that would be of interest to us. But it has to be breakthrough.
So I think I'm not going to strike too many new notes here. A clear explanation of why your company is differentiated from its competitors, how it will reach clinical proof of concept or some other driver of exit, and how much you're trying to raise should be in the first paragraph that an investor sees, because that's your chance to actually capture their attention. I'll bring out a hobby horse of mine. What should probably not be in a pitch to an investor is an explanation of what disease you're targeting is, if it's something that's very common. I at one point worked for a family office that reviewed cystic fibrosis therapies, and exclusively cystic fibrosis therapies. And I think I've probably have seen 300 slides trying to tell me exactly what cystic fibrosis is or why it's a bad thing. So presumably you're approaching professional investors in pharma or biotech. You don't need to recapitulate very basic parts of the disease process in your presentation or in your cover letter, or tell us that there are very many cancer patients or diabetes patients, unless it's explicitly focused on how your therapy can reach a certain subsegment of patients that haven't really been thought about, or that have a disease that is unlike the rest of that indication.
Great, thanks. All good comments.
Can I add something?
Yes, of course.
One point that also I want to mention is risk analysis. A lot of presentation, they cover everything in pink and blue. I think from an investor perspective, I want to say that somebody is really open-minded. He knows exactly where the risk is, and he's not shy away from the risk. So he tells the investors the risk is there. I know how to manage the risk. I know when I'm going to manage it, when I'm going to tackle it, and I'm going to mitigate the risk. One of the things that I do at least is I'm looking at a project or a company, I'm saying, where is the risk? That's what I'm looking for. Because we also have limited resources, and we don't want to be in position investing $5 million and then finding out that you need to invest another 20 until you get to a point where you really know if the technology works. Happen all the time. And then you have to make a decision. You already invested in $5 million. So really risk analysis slide that tells very openly and clearly, this is the risk, this is where I'm going to mitigate the risk. It's very important to us. I'm sure that also for others. It's something you have to have on your slides.
I think it's come up now, probably in every comment that's been made, is the data is what's really the most important. All the rest of it will follow. But think about a creative solution to get human proof of concept as inexpensively and as quickly as possible. You know, timelines where there's 4 years of manufacturing and non-clinical work before you can get to a first-in-man study becomes very difficult to fund, because you end up in that situation. You put the first $5 million, it's a bridge to nowhere, and it's $20 more million to get to that concept. There are creative solutions to a lot of these problems if you get either consultants or other advisors that will help you think outside the normal traditional box of human proof of concept, because that addresses the risk question of, is this have a chance of working in real people with real disease? And if you can answer that question earlier in your development program, you can go back and fill in some of the other nice to haves. That's the biggest need to have and the biggest value inflection for you, your past investors and new investors. So I would say that's one of the things that at PBM Capital we look for, is assets that you can do that for, or entrepreneurs who are willing to think about it from that perspective and not think about, this is how Drug Development 101, the book tells me I should run my program, so that's what I'm going to do. Because you'll get there eventually, but by the time you've done that, you've raised either too much money, the valuation's got too high, and so your future finances are difficult. So you always have to think about, how much money am I raising now, and then where does it get to me? Where does it get on the program? And then what is the next round of capital going to look like? Recognizing that preclinical assets that need a valuation of $30 or $40 million for the next investors to invest where the previous investors aren't washed out is a difficult proposition when the assets are that expensive to start early in development.
So what are some of the shortcuts?
There are ways you can do things either in other countries. There are ways you can use products that have been approved or are, we call it homeopathic in some mechanism, where you can test things in a way where you can work with the FDA. if you can support the general safety of your product and it's a creative solution to address an unmet need, that's fine. Or you find an orphan disease or a rare disease where you can get into target patients sooner and then go back for the broader market. So there's a number of things you can do in that regard. There's ways to think about manufacturing and other regulatory agencies as well outside the US that might be able to be helpful with that.
Don't do it on your family.
No, don't test on yourself.
Yeah.
That's,
But Australia, for example, I know with several companies is around really supporting clinical studies in Australia. You get about 45% reimbursement on the clinical trials there.
yep, we've done that.
Yeah, so I think there are opportunities to do proof of concept.
One other thing to add might be to start to view the risk of your company the way an investor thinks about risk and understand which milestones you can achieve that actually de-risk the product quickly versus which are milestones that don't actually contribute much to de-risking. And classically, one of the milestones that entrepreneurs tend to get very excited about, but for example, I don't believe it substantially de-risks an asset, is completion of GMP manufacture on a biologic. It is a challenge, and manufacturing is not always easy, but at the same time, the completion of GMP manufacture doesn't tell us a whit about whether or not the drug would actually function in human disease. So when you get a sense of where investors see the risk leaving your product or which things are key to actually de-risking your product, you can start to think about structuring financings and blocks of money that make sense so that each investor who's entered into the financing at one round will see an appreciation of their assets when they move to the next round.
You go back to that one question because I don't think I answered your question with a specific
Well,
example.
It's not how you're gonna get any breakthroughs that way, you know, if you're repurposing drugs.
So, for example, there was a program that envisioned a new biologic. It was a biologic product, and it was example as a component in nutraceutical-based products or products within the GNC sort of family. And we were able to run a clinical study by purchasing those food-grade materials, formulating and testing a clinical hypothesis before we did any of the GMP manufacturing. It was going to cost $30 million to get cell lines manufacturing for this multi-component product to test the hypothesis. And we were able to get GMP-made material by purchasing it in a different purpose, speaking with the agencies for like $1 million. So there was a creative way to solve problems. If it's a brand new NCE, it's harder to do some of those things. You're better off trying to take advantage of Australian tax credits or some other components of other regulatory agencies. But I think you'll also find that the FDA has been a lot more approachable and trying to be helpful to companies if you ask them and work with them in the right way to address their key concerns. But you don't necessarily have to do every single thing that a big pharma company would do that doesn't like to see failure. Or importantly, when they're running the program, if you failed something later, they come back, well, you should have done this non-clinical assay and this non-clinical assay and 17 rodent studies. I think about what the risk tolerances are, like Alex said, and get that inflection point and spend the money wisely so you can get the better valuation.
Another good way to address risk is creative company building, right? From advisory board, your board. I mean, not just dressing up names. If you, for instance, have a manufacturing issue or risk, you have a new novel compound or something like that, get the right people associated with your company. You could even go that far. I've seen it recently with a company. Partnering sometimes can de-risk certain assets, especially if the partner has maybe a certain system, a certain production facility, something which could help you. You obviously have to weigh in whether the partnership in general makes sense, but there are very creative ways to de-risk your assets.
Great.
What do you think about hybrid models? So, for example, a startup that starts with with a cosmetic or with medical food while keeping always a pipeline of biotech technology? Is that a valid way to the risk? Is that deviating focus? What do you think?
So it's an excellent question. We're actually looking at two opportunities right now. There are some interesting platforms out there which you can take into different areas, consumer health and therapeutic applications, industrial applications, etc. That's very attractive. However, you need to keep in mind all of these things need capitalization as well. You also need to keep the IP in mind because you might have, certainly in the private sector, different exit points. Which one do you start first? It really depends on the opportunity, but it also depends on the know-how of the team, the founders, and how you can initially shape the company. But it can absolutely be done. But generally speaking, very often if you do 2 or 3 of those in parallel, you have some economies of scale, but you probably require a higher degree of capitalization.
Any other questions? We've got just a few minutes left, I'm told.
I was just curious, I had somebody recently tell me they were looking at, kind of going along with this de-risking thing, using the drug that was in clinical trials. It had an indication that was useful in animals, and they were kind of looking at using that to kind of maybe generate some revenue. I don't know whether they could really look at any data from that, but I was just curious if you'd had any experience in something like that.
So we've done one deal recently where there is human clinical potential in tendinopathy. And that attracted our attention because we had some idea of the unmet medical need there. But what we were actually surprised to see is that well before any pharma partner had gotten to this company, the veterinary medicine people had actually come up and offered a partnership on the development of the compound for veterinary use. And we were actually very welcoming of that because we don't have the same degree of expertise as the people at this veterinary medicine company. And the vet med studies will occur before the human clinical studies, and we'll get some presumably some read-through from the vet model to the human disease. So in that sense, we're very welcoming of it. Developing veterinary medicines on our own is not something we would attempt, though. The clinical situation is different, and the reimbursement model is very different, and to some degree, even more reliant on scale.
So we actually also have one of our portfolio companies that was exploring testing the human product in a canine model, and it turned out that you were able to run and recruit animals with disease that you can test your product in and get real world experience in a canine model, for example, of osteoarthritis. So if you, in this case it was a biologic, so we were using a human biologic in the animals, so you don't need CBM, sign off, it's just an IRB approval. And that data has proven valuable both for generating partnering discussions on the animal health side, but also in support of the human clinical side. So if you're choosing the right model, it can be helpful if the disease is actually relevant between the species. A lot of times it's not, but if you can generate large animal data, it's way better than rodent data, and real models versus created models is also a better analogy of how it likely may perform in humans.
If I may, just a second, I can tell you that the concept of getting your product approved for veterinary use before to humans is not an attractive idea, because what happens if it's being misused in animals and then creates tox issues because it was not used properly, and you still develop it for humans. So that's a risk that we don't think that if you develop a drug for humans, it's smart. We believe that first you have to get it approved for humans, and then if it's suitable for veterinary use, you can do that, but not the opposite.
One
Yes,
last question. Each of you, can you say how much capital do you invest in one single round, and then what's the maximum valuation you would consider, and then how much do you keep in reserve for future rounds? Very quickly, one by one.
That's too slow.
So we've, in first investments, we've invested anywhere between £500,000 and 3 million. For range of valuations, that really depends on what the company is doing, but I'll at least make a stab at it. We tend to look at preclinical therapeutics companies that typically have something on the order of a lead candidate that's ready for IND enabling studies. The valuations we've seen range from, let's say, 1.5 to at most 5.
Thank you.
We've invested from a couple $100,000 to tens of millions. And I would say valuation-wise, if it's preclinical, in the 5 range or lower is probably realistic. But we've bought phase 3 drugs in the middle of phase 3, so it's kind of hard to put a bucket around
Well,
that.
these are all early stage
Yeah.
investors, so
So-
they probably don't have phase 3 assets. They might be sitting here.
So there's been a few late-stage drugs in this meeting.
Yeah.
So we've done 100,000 to the latest was close to 6 million, so quite a wide range. In terms of valuation, that's tricky. It depends obviously on the stage, but anything from 3 to 10. I would say the higher range is not so much dependent on the stage of the investment. We are very sensitive to having good teams, good founders involved, and maybe there we would pay a little premium because to us that's a major de-risking factor as well.
We're the same, 100,000 to 20 million is actually valuation. Single digit, low single digits, up to 20, $30 million free money.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the time out. Thanks so much. I appreciate everyone attending, and I hope we made you think a little bit. Thanks.